Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the Bay Area Experience Evidence-Based Policy Webinar Series organized by the Policy Research at Hong Kong IAPS and co-sponsored by the CUHK Global China Research Program. I'm Fanny Cheung, the convener of Policy Research at Hong Kong IAPS and the moderator of this webinar series. The CUHK Policy Research at Hong Kong IAPS program is dedicated to promoting cross-boundary and interdisciplinary collaboration on policy research. To facilitate academic exchanges and social awareness of different policy issues, we invite scholars, policymakers, and stakeholders to discuss policies across different areas. The focus of this series is the strategic development of the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, Greater Bay Area, or in short, GBA, one of the strategic focus research areas of our Global China Research Program. The development of the GBA is key to the strategic development of the country. The aim is to leverage the advantages of the two special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau, and the 9 municipalities in the Guangdong province, and to contribute to cooperation and integration among districts and to promote regional economic development. The plans for the Greater Bay Area cover multiple policy issues, including innovation and technology, economy, urban planning, education, and more. We have planned a monthly Greater Bay Area webinar through August this year. Today's webinar is on emerging public realm of the Greater Bay Area, approaches to public space in the Chinese Megaregion. This webinar discusses recent public space trends in the Greater Bay Area emerging in the context of the region's rapid urban development. It addresses issues of policies, social inclusion, participation, and appropriation in the production of everyday urbanism. It identifies opportunities for reconfiguring design-driven urban practice beyond traditional interventions manifested by the design of physical objects and public amenities, to the design of new social protocols, processes, infrastructures, and capabilities. The webinar will also share insights gained in public space studies during the pandemic, co-developed by the two speakers. Our two speakers today are Professor Hendrik Tieben, Director of our School of Architecture at CUHK, and Professor Miodrag Mitrasinovic, Professor of Architecture and Urbanism, Parsons School of Design at the New School, United States. Our two speakers will be engaged in an interactive dialogue of the topic for about 15 minutes. Participants are invited to join in the discussion during the Q&A session. Please post your comments or questions in the chat box addressed to our administrator, and we'll call upon you to raise your question during the Q&A session. Let me first introduce our two speakers. Professor Hendrik Tieben is the director of the School of Architecture at CUHK. His work as an urban designer, researcher, and educator is devoted to the creation of healthy and inclusive cities. Over the last years, he developed a series of public space and place-making projects to empower local communities. The projects have been featured in international publications and biennial exhibitions. In his recent Worldwide University Network project, Professor Tieben focused on the relationship between urban form, health, and well-being. In this context, he co-initiated with the Journal of Public Space the project 2020 a year without public space under COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Miodrag is a professor of architecture and urbanism at the Parsons School of Design, a division of the New School University. His professional and scholarly work has been published internationally, and he has served in a variety of scholarly, professional, and editorial roles. Most recently, Miodrag co-edited the books The Emerging Public Realm of the Greater Bay Area, Approaches to Public Space in a Chinese Megaregion, published by Routledge in 2021, and The Public Space Reader, also published by Routledge in 2021. Several of his books received book production grants from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tieben and Professor Mitrasinovic. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Fanny Cheung, for the kind introduction and also the invitation to this event. We are always very interested in joining interdisciplinary work, and I think it's very interesting to be part of this policy series. When we look at the topic of GBA and public space, of course, we can go back to the early announcements and the framework agreement, which was made on in 2017, and basically launching also this new theme of the Greater Bay Area development, in addition to what we heard before, the Pearl River Delta planning. Many of the projects that are linked to the Greater Bay Area, or before also already when it was called the Pearl River Delta, are infrastructure projects that more and more help to basically interlink and integrate the entire area. So I will also come back later to some of those infrastructure projects. But of course, when it's about the space of it, many people might refer to, and we can also see this here on the government website, to either architecture buildings or urban spaces, here, for example, in Zhongshan and also Huizhou, as ways to understand what does it actually mean to be part of the Greater Bay Area in our daily perception. Now, at CUHK, at our urban design program, we organized since, I think, around 2013, an initiative where we organized different design studios, which we called the comparative studios, that were linking always studies in different places in the, at that time, first Pearl River Delta and now Greater Bay Area, to compare and contrast what's happening in different places. Like, for example, we had studios that would look at, let's say, urban villages, and then we organized studios that would happen in parallelly in Hong Kong, then by colleagues in universities in Macau, basically inviting us to come over with our students and looking at conditions in Macau, and also research groups in Shenzhen. And that was a very interesting way of understanding how maybe always one particular issue is handled in various places around the Greater Bay Area, and through that also get a better understanding of the different similarities and differences. In this context, so one thing was that we worked in the Greater Bay Area. The other point was that we, with the students, also reached out to international collaborations and brought them to other places, and also received visitors from other places. So what happened in 2019, just before the pandemic, is that the team of Professor Mitrasinovic arrived in Hong Kong at CUHK, and we worked on a Greater Bay Area workshop looking at designing infrastructures for inclusion. And basically what we did at that time, 2019, if you remember, were a lot of new infrastructure projects were just created. It was just the bridge to Macau and Zhuhai was just opened. And in fact, we took this bridge with the bus, our photos from this visit. But also we looked at other projects. But at the same time, we had this idea to balance or to see infrastructures, both physical infrastructures, but also social infrastructures for people. Also because Miodrag, who is here and will start to talk in a second, wrote another book that is, or edited and wrote on designing infrastructures for inclusion, which was very important for our collaboration. Now, I want to stop here and give the word to Miodrag, because the reason why when Fanny Cheung invited our School of Architecture to organize this event with her, I thought it would be very nice to invite Miodrag, first of all, because since 2019 or even 2018, we started to regularly work together with our students, but also because he just published last year a book, The Emerging Public Realm of the Greater Bay Area, together with Tieben, and which I think fits, of course, I believe, very well into this event today. And we also contributed a small part to this book, which I will refer later when I come back after Miodrag's presentation. So Miodrag, maybe you can start your part.
As Hendrik already mentioned, we started working in 2015 on basically really investigating the emerging public realm of, at that time, Pearl River Delta, since the Greater Bay Area for the first time really appears prominently in 2016. So we brought our students together in a cross-disciplinary efforts to begin to, again, map out the new approaches and new practices emerging across the Pearl River Delta. In 2015, the same year, Professor Timothy Jakna and myself agreed to start conceptualizing a couple of conferences we organized in 2016, 2017. With the first one in Hong Kong at Hong Kong Polytechnic, where Professor Jakna was teaching at the time. Right now, he's Dean of the School of Architecture, Planning, Art and Design at the University of Cincinnati in the United States. And we brought a series of about 26 colleagues in 2 different events in order to discuss the emerging public realm of the Greater Bay Area, and particularly the approaches to the design, interpretation, management, and studies of public space. We then assembled the presentations into a book. Of course, each of the authors was invited then to contribute with an elaborated chapter based on their presentation at the conference. And almost every single author enthusiastically accepted this invitation. Hendrik and his colleagues were, of course, also included in the conference and then later on in the book. And as Hendrik said, he will explain and talk about his contribution in a couple of minutes. So overall, 26 colleagues, 17 chapters. In this book, we worked on basically, therefore, since 2016. It came out last year, so for about 5 years. The book presented a number of challenges to us, both from the editorial point of view, but also to many of the authors in the book. It was an attempt not to come up with anything conclusive in terms of a ultimate way of either theorizing or interpreting or understanding the new public realm as it has emerged, particularly in the transition from PRD to GBA. after 2015-16, but to really come up with a sort of a map of a variety of different approaches to the subject matter. I authored two chapters in the book. Timothy Jacquena, my co-editor, wrote the introduction to the book, and then I wrote the two chapters that basically one tries to situate the transition of PRD to GBA in the context of mega-region and mega-regionality and the theory of mega-regions. And then the chapter 17, which is basically the last chapter in the book, which then really addresses the nature of the public space and the character of public spaces as they, again, emerge at a number of different scales. I will talk about it in a moment, a number of different scales across the GBA. The transition of the GBA, the 13th National Urbanization Plan, the 13th five-year plan, I'm sorry, is the first one that actually really establishes a mega-regional imaginary and the mega-regions as the platform for the urbanization of China as a whole. At that time, Pearl River Delta, prior to 2015, Pearl River Delta was, as most of you, of course, know, the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world. So in between 1978 and 2008, officially, Pearl River Delta was actually the most rapidly urbanizing urban territory in the world, projected to have 80 million people by 2035. Once the GBA and the GBA imaginary was established, it became clear, a number of things became clear. One, of course, that the mega-regional imaginary and the mega-regional imagination as the future platform for the urbanization of China was also a part of a larger project of what some authors have called the planetary urbanization, led by, of course, the Chinese government's investment in over 70 countries around the world in terms of building infrastructure, roads, bridges, tunnels, and so on and so forth. I actually sit 100 meters away from the headquarters of the Chinese company, state subsidiary in Serbia, which actually has built a number of roads, bridges, and railway lines here in Serbia in the last 10 plus years. This undertaking, the Belt and Road Initiative, plus the 23 mega-regional developments within China, all interconnected by robust communication and infrastructure lines, is, as I write in this chapter, is of breathtaking scale. Never before seen. And this is one of the diagrams that actually shows the level of investment, of Chinese investment abroad, particularly in North Africa, Europe, even in the United States and South America as well. So our question was basically, how can we, and under what conditions, frame public space as a relevant and coherent analytical unit in the context of mega-regionalism and vis-a-vis the emerging GBA mega-region. For those of you who are not familiar with the theory of mega-regions, mega-regionalism, mega-regions as of 1990s appear to be a new way of ordering economic production capacities and capabilities at the scale never before known. In fact, mega-regions are compared to global economy in the way analogically to what metropolitan economies were in relation to national economies. In other words, unprecedented scale and agglomeration of economic activity, characterized, of course, by mobile and very skilled, innovative workforce, labor force, open global markets, and so on and so forth. As Professor Fanny Cheung in introduction already indicated some of these major characteristics in the context of China. So in order to understand then where and how the public realm and public space play in this, what I propose is to look at two different aspects of mega-regional development. One is the GBA mega-regionalism, which is, as Professor Cheung already indicated, a national strategy focused on governance, economy, planning, and urban policy, and operationalized through the production of mega-regional space. And I will talk about mega-regional space in a moment. So if you look at the scale and agglomeration of mega-regions across the world, you will see that on the right with orange dots, you will see at that point mega-regions emerging in China. You can see the one in purple across Europe, and you will see around 13 mega-regions actually developing across the United States. The only one in South America, for example, is the one in Sao Paulo. But if you look at the land coverage of the mega-regions today, you will see, as the UN World Cities Report indicates, you will see that they occupy a very small portion of land, of territory, particularly highly urbanized territories. But at the same time, they produce over nearly 70% of all wealth production across the world. In China alone, the 3 largest mega regions, GBA is one of them, produce nearly 60% of overall national wealth produced annually, which is a breathtaking and stunning number. As you can see, it's here, as the economist indicates, 19 super regions, but actually there are 23 mega regions under construction and development. And of course, they, as much as mega regions indicate international, global competitiveness, you can see here a comparison, for example, of the GBA with other Bay areas across the world, New York, San Francisco, and Tokyo Bay. But they also indicate competitiveness and internally within mega regions themselves, which of course, as the economic theory argues, is in fact good for the development of the global aspirations of local and regional economies. And some of I will go through this very quickly, some of the slides that basically indicate to the way in which this political and economic homogenization within the mega-regional territory of the GBA, in fact, has moved forward extremely quickly after 2016, and after the framework plan, which Hendrik already mentioned, of 2000, I believe, 17. This is not to go unnoticed, in fact, that the urban designers and in the Greater Bay Area also fairly quickly inaugurated the Greater Bay Area Urban Design Alliance, and of course organized their own design week in June of 2020, 2 years ago. But what is really interesting about this is that mega-regionalism is impossible to understand and particularly to visualize without really the involvement of urban planners and urban designers, and as well as, of course, architects. As in somewhat a Foucauldian sense, they become the technologies of power. They, in fact, establish on the ground what urban policy and urban plan, 5-year plans establish in terms of an imaginary. They actually realize that in concrete terms on the ground. As Jacques Ellul has written, this is where people experience mega-regionalism in flesh through the work of urban design and architecture. On the other hand, GBA mega-regionality is it develops in parallel with mega-regionalism. So again, mega-regionalism is national strategy focused on governance, planning, policy, and so on and so forth. But mega-regionality actually is an ongoing process of producing mega-regional geographies, operationalized through the production of spaces of and in the mega-region. These are the concrete spaces where people, as I said, begin to experience these larger national and global narratives in flesh through everyday life and through everyday experience. So some of these spaces are the normative official spaces, such as, the border crossings and the institutional spaces. spaces of the central business districts, spaces and spaces of riverfronts and so on and so forth. And others are the so-called messy interstitial spaces where people actually get together, spaces of social reproduction and spaces in urban villages and elsewhere where daily life occurs and daily negotiations around priorities of the regular people in everyday situations are negotiated. In that context of this everyday negotiation, what is also interesting, and I describe that in the book, is what I borrow from another author, tactical sub-regionalism, the idea and the concept of tactical sub-regionalism. In other words, collaborative, civically and socially engaged practices that emerge at the intersections of infrastructure, network governance, and community organizing, and that focus on the issues relevant in the specific public spaces in and of the Megaregion. Such spaces are the loci for struggles over the constitution of new publics. That's really then the tension in between the overall panoramic, strategic, Cartesian, almost national strategy, and then the daily life of regular people in which, as I said before, the daily priorities are negotiated in common, shared public spaces. So back to the question, how can we frame this question? Therefore, within this context of Megaregion, we as collectively, as a group of 26, therefore, authors, argue a couple of things. First, that public space is a significant, timely subject for scholars and professionals working in China today. Second, that public space has been an important catalyst for the emergence of the Greater Bay Area public realm, the new realm of the public realm of the Greater Bay Area. Third, that public space can be framed as a proper analytical unit. And I will tell you why in a moment, why this has been a very contested issue. Four, that public space must be studied and conceptualized across the differentiated scales and organizational levels of the GBA megaregion. And finally, that public spaces should be considered inseparable from other arenas in which public is simultaneously constituted. So in addition to space, therefore, the public realm as sites and spaces of collectivization and symbolic practices often demarcated by the built environment. Public sphere, a domain of discursive social relations centered on communication. Public domain, a regulatory arena where legal and policy dimensions of public sites and gatherings are determined and debated. These are inseparable from the idea of the public space. In other words, public realm, sphere, and domain and space really, in conjunction, in fact, determine the real character of the GBA, the emerging public realm of the GBA. So within this context, then, let me get to the actual reading and analysis and study of public spaces as they have emerged. So one type, as I mentioned already, is a mega-regional public space. I call it TMPS just so that I gave it an acronym just so that it actually facilitates further reading in the book. So mega-regional public space, as said before, a catalyst for the realignment of governance, economic development, and infrastructure in the GBA. And then the public spaces in the GBA megaregion, a medium of resistance to the twin meta-narratives of globalization and urbanization, but also as a vehicle for organizing through the increasingly design-led tactical sub-regionalism. I will say about the design-led in a moment. Together, they configure what we have called the emerging public realm. And so then let me distinguish between these two, because I think for the, I know that for the authors in the book, they operate actually in between the two. Most of them are either talking about or discussing the mega-regional public space, the normative, official, and so on and so forth, and others like Hendrik, for example, about the public spaces in the mega-region where design plays a different role. That's one of the points I wanted to also clearly come across, is that design, broadly construed, broadly understood, plays a very different role in the context of the production of mega-regional public space and in the context of the production of the public spaces in the mega-region. Whereas in the context of a mega-regional public space, participation, for example, plays nearly no role whatsoever. In the context of the public spaces in the mega-region, in fact, participation, resident participation, community participation actually plays and should play a very important role. The first one is I will share is a couple of examples of the mega-regional public space as infrastructural spaces. This is a Kowloon station, and you have it from the territorial scale to the interior, the vast interior of the Kowloon station, to the border crossing area, and finally to the level of the trains, connecting this vast infrastructure network that I don't have now the time to describe in detail, but this is one of those aggregate maps of all the railway networks within the GBA, and the ways in which now, without obviously administrative boundaries in light gray, a interconnected railway network across the GBA mega region. And then the crossings, the border crossings, the gates, Hendrik showed also some of the images we made in 2019. Actually, some of these images were made at that time during our workshop. So the different border crossings across the GBA, which now begin to demarcate this new infrastructural space, which is at the same time normative, official, and powerful, but also quite emptied of variation, dynamism, interpretation, and so on and so forth. So therefore, an official strategic public space. And then, of course, the Grand Urban Room, the Civic Square in Shenzhen, in Fujian, in 2008 and 18. So you can see, obviously, 2008, what am I saying? 98 and 2018, obviously, radical difference. And then, particularly in the case of the Central Square and the Fujian district, of course, the so-called leftover spaces in urban villages, which pose a direct contrast to the normative character of the Civic Square. And then open spaces, I said before, the system of open spaces has been very important in the imagination and the work of urban planners working both in Shenzhen and, for example, and in the Central Planning Office in Beijing. The reason why also is, as many Chinese scholars and practitioners have also argued, I've learned from all of them, that in fact it is very difficult to really characterize properly public space in China, because the nuanced differences between public and official space and public and open space make it very difficult to delineate the difference between public and open. Nevertheless, if you look at the Western developments in these distinctions between the open space systems and public space systems, for example, public space it has a very strong political character. So therefore, depoliticization of public space leaves you with one possibility only, which is to, in fact, discuss public space as an open space. The difference between public space and open space, for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with practice and literature, planning and design, the difference is because the open space is the aggregate of all open spaces, spaces accessible to public, green, streets, squares, parks, forests, and so on and so forth, riverfronts, and so on and so forth. And in fact, the way in which, for example, in China, open space is calculated per capita is different than, let's say, in the United States or in Europe. The public space, on the other hand, as opposed to open space, public space actually is always, at least in the Western experience, is always dedicated to some form of constitution of public, or multiple publics, in fact, in a democracy, right? And so this tension between multiple publics, the constitution of publics, and the open character of public space has been present with us for a very long time, not only in China, but also in many other places across the world, even in the United States, right? And even in the most democratic of democratic societies. So therefore, this is a tension that exists in practice as well as in literature. And it is not surprising, of course, that in China, particularly in the GBA, an emphasis on open space systems is much more prominent than an emphasis on public space systems. Although the Shenzhen's planning office has about 10 years ago or so also launched a project that never was completed on the study and design of public space systems in the GBA. But again, these are very critical distinctions, both in literature and in the practice of planners and designers, for those of you who are not familiar with literature and practice of planning, urban planning and design. The mega-regional public space also works as an economic engine. Needless to say, mega regions are economic engines, vehicles for growth, economic growth. Economic growth does not always bring development, particularly not cultural development and social development. Economic growth is an aim on its own. And in this sense, that the mega-regional public space, in fact, is an economic engine. One of the examples I use is Macau, of course, the casinos and the Cotai Strip and so on and so forth, particularly in relation to also the spectacularization of historical heritage in this context, particularly then in relation to the interstitial small market spaces in the old town. And then what you have is, of course, this is the work of some of the authors in the book, the development of riverfronts across the GBA. This is in Hong Kong, for which also, particularly for some of the riverfronts and cultural districts that were the subject of international competitions, where that brings us back to the argument that architecture and urban design and planning work as disciplinary technologies. There is a cast of star architects who also, of course, were involved in some of who were involved also in the design of the Civic Square and other buildings across Shenzhen, that bring together a series of design tropes that you can find in Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Guangzhou. You can also find it in Belgrade, in Serbia. You can find it in Amsterdam. You can find it in New York, which are basically the signature elements of this neoliberal globalized capital that lands whenever it can easily be accumulated and reproduced. And then, of course, the three olds regeneration policy, under which many of the abandoned buildings and sites across the GBA were commodified, commercialized, created into symbolic, of course, venues, and offered as such to the local audiences as well as the tourists. In contrast to the mega regional public space, now we talk about public spaces in the mega region. So these are these interstitial kind of sporadic, not systemic public spaces that occur through appropriation, contestation, and occasionally through occupation of public sites across the GBA. So I will spare you now the details, but some of these, for example, the student protest in Hong Kong, different signs of occupation through which the central business district, the airport on the upper slide, were appropriated, occupied really in order to communicate certain political messages, the umbrella movement, and so on and so forth, as well as the cyclical regular sites such as the HSBC Bank and the Sunday mornings to which the domestic foreign workers gather and organize their kind of social life outside of the places of work. Interstitial spaces across the city. And then Hendrik will talk about this. This is one of the projects of Hendrik and his team in which they collaborated with the local community organization in order to, again, appropriate and convert a street space into a public space of gathering, cultural production, and social reproduction. And in that particular case, I think what is really interesting is to bring back the role of design. So the introduction of design as an instrumental medium here is indispensable. On the one hand, and this really comes through the work of not only professional designers and professional planners, but also those who are really interested in contributing to understanding and promoting the design literacy of some kind. On the one hand, design functions as a means for organizing associational activities in the social space of civil society to expedite the emergence of new subjectivities, shared meanings, and novel civic and social imaginaries. On the other hand, design works as a catalyst for urban coalitions and communities, as well as the third sector organizations, to define and represent their needs, desires, expectations, and demands to others in the public sphere, as they contest and negotiate desired outcomes in their interactions with institutions and systems of power. Design also demonstrates the potential of new cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary approaches to the production of public space, which not only provide more responsive environments for recreation and enjoyment, or for negotiation, contestation, and occupation, but also reintroduce the critical need to reestablish connective spatial tissue for civic life, a new public realm. So with that, I will only show you a few more slides to indicate one more thing, is that most of the authors in the book are also educators and from across different educational spaces. This is one of the examples. I'll be very, very brief, Hendrik. One of the examples from Hong Kong. This is another one. And then I just wanted to quickly come to this. This is actually some of the collaborations with the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Polytechnic and University of Macau and Shenzhen University, where we worked all together in a couple of years on public spaces in Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Macau, and then produced after each of them these books that document our collaborative work. So with that, Hendrik, I'll give it back to you.
I think Miodrag already discussed many of the points that also are important for my presentation, and I can maybe go a little bit faster through these parts. So basically what I want to add to Miodrag's presentation, which I think already also particularly also theoretically try to frame the Megaregion and the relationship of public space in this kind of context, to add on additional perspectives that are related to where we are now with the pandemic. Of course, we are all affected by this. And in fact, usually from Hong Kong, of course, we would go probably 2 times per month or more often to our neighbors here in the River Delta or Greater Bay Area. But that was, of course, very much constrained in the last years. So I pick up from Miodrag this differentiation between public space of the Greater Bay Megaregion, or TMPS, how you call it, and public space in the Greater Bay Megaregion, and basically this kind of dualism between those different spaces that also Miodrag already introduced. He also already mentioned these infrastructural spaces. One of them was, of course, the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge, which we visited together, and we were very interested at that time. It just started that there were a lot of discussions, for example, about the spaces on the both sides of the bridge, how those areas would transform with these kind of new infrastructures. However, with the pandemic, of course, this huge project that I'm sure after the pandemic will be much more used, but at the moment is kind of very much also hindered in a way through an event like a pandemic, right? So the question of resilience comes up, right? And the question of like how we can deal with the complexity of the reality of events that might disturb our way of planning. The same thing also when we see the relationship between the different territories. For example, in 2018, we were quite interested in the way how Macau and Zhuhai, or here also Hong Kong and Shenzhen, worked together. And of course, it was a time where, with this idea of the regional development of the Greater Bay Area, those new territories were carved out with particular legal status, like Hengqin or Qianhai in Shenzhen, actually already before 2017 probably, and then even more stronger. And the kind of very big developments that we have now, basically just adjacent to Macau on the Zhuhai side, and in Wanzai, Zhuhai, and Hengqin, that create this kind of new realm between these two cities. But of course, then with the pandemic, all kind of complexities existed, because what usually is very smart to have like different legal status and so on to organize space and also for certain kind of economic opportunities, then all of a sudden became very, very difficult. Particularly also, we heard about Macau, and we know that at the moment Macau's casino industry, which basically to a very large extent is basically financing Macau's government, is basically at 1% of the revenues of the pre-pandemic time. So it's kind of very much constrained by the pandemic, and also questions maybe a certain kind of model where, for example, the entire Cotai Strip was given to gambling and tourism rather to before plan New Town in this area. So of course, this will probably pick up very soon after the opening again and the end of quarantines and so on. It's very likely that probably a lot of economic success can be made here, but it also shows there's a certain kind of question of resilience, or also the question like how to balance maybe better projects that at any time there is more balance between different stakeholders, but particularly also to think about what happens if certain kind of crises occur. The other point is here the Kowloon station, the Hong Kong West Kowloon railway station, which opened in 2018, and basically since 2020 is closed as a very important piece of infrastructure. Again, these are infrastructures they built probably for the next 100 years. So they will be used and so on. But at the moment there are a lot of difficulties. Now, on the other hand, of course, the situation on the ground and in the pandemic and the kind of challenges that are in existing neighborhoods, particularly maybe of low income populations. So, for example, we made a research related to people living in the subdivided flats and how they use public space or also not, because then many people surprisingly don't use certain kind of public spaces for various gender reasons or other things that we can maybe also come back in the discussion. Now, the other points, of course, the public spaces in the Greater Bay Area region, so not basically the officially planned one, but basically other forms of public space making. And also appropriation of public space. And in this little piece that we wrote for Miodrag's book, we focused on that aspect. I will just go very quickly through it because of time limitations. But this was research that was mainly on the Hong Kong side, and we were also basically trapped. We often go to Macau and work there and so on, but all this was difficult. However, just to maybe highlight three points that we found interesting here in this research that I did with Ying-Fan Chen, the postdoc at that time at our school, where we looked at different forms of public space making that are not entirely unrelated to government planning. It's actually interesting, but there are different stakeholders that come in, and which is kind of an interesting trend, I believe, in Hong Kong and in many parts of the world. In fact, Miodrag also described similar ways of public space making in North America and so on. So for example, I will not talk about own projects, but just to mention, there are forms of academia, charity-led public space co-creations, and we were involved in something like this, but it was at the same time facilitated by government funds. So it's basically something where the government has a slightly different role in basically encouraging placemaking in public spaces made by communities, or to be more precise, in this case, for example, academia, in that case, CUHK, and charity, Caritas. Or if we see the work of Make a Difference in Hong Kong, where an NGO led basically a public space co-creation, on one hand to improve public spaces, but also as a very interesting means to innovate government departments. So very much actually sees it mission not only in those kind of public space projects that they would do, but particularly become an agent of innovation of policies, but also the government actors, to bring them into the project and learn with them about co-creation processes. Here, particularly a project related to healthy streets, in that also then partly still happened during the pandemic in 2020. And a last project that I found quite exciting, quite interesting, that is basically this Bishop Hill community exercise space. That we found already intriguing before the pandemic, but then after the pandemic, or in the pandemic even more, which is actually a project that was made directly by community or citizens that initiated this project, and maybe even more successful than many things that maybe we are doing as professional designers, because it's very much linked maybe to the needs also of the community. So this space, for example, is in the middle of the most dense area of Hong Kong, on a hill in between Mong Kok and Shek Kip Mei and Sham Shui Po, where a SARS survivor walked up basically this hill, which is quite challenging, it's quite steep, and started to create with other people that he got to know, basically an exercise space in which residents of this super dense and very impoverished area can come 24 hours and basically use this exercise space for free, and using informally actually a space between two fences. And particularly we found this exciting or interesting because of this kind of connection to the SARS epidemic, which then actually became very interesting because when we were writing about this project, we all of a sudden found ourselves in the COVID-19 pandemic. And also to compare the design quality to design sometimes delivered by government, but also designers, also architects that have, for example, street furniture is always exposed to the sun and so on in the wrong place, and how, for example, with how much ingenuity and wisdom something like this is kind of built together with almost no budget, but very appropriate to the Hong Kong conditions. So that were kind of for us learning examples of a kind of other forms of public space making. And I think this is part, of course, of a much larger phenomenon in Hong Kong, where many NGOs, charities, different organizations, but there are probably much more that one could add here, are active as civil society actors to be part in working together with the government or independently in various kind of constellations and add quality to public space. So I think my time is almost over. Just want to say, show 2 or 3 more images where is it, for example, is there always a conflict between those two? Not necessarily. One interesting observation I find is when we look at the new spaces around the M+ and the West Kowloon Cultural District, which is of course a very much also political project and government project at a very large scale. Interestingly, one finds here new forms of public space adaptations that usually one would never find in Hong Kong in public parks and official spaces where people really adapt those places and picnic here and so on and use these spaces in a much more open. On the other hand, new aspects, of course, of public space, the use of public space for testing centers and so on during the pandemic. The question how, on one hand, important digital media devices maybe to help us to fight the pandemic also affect the public space use potentially by people basically escaping all spaces where they need to register for certain times so that they have their own dynamics, even though they're important to a certain degree, but also create a new dynamism where people start to go around and basically use all those spaces that don't require to log in. As we see, for example, even barbecue places in the countryside that are closed off, but then actually people start to build their tent cities around and barbecue next to it, right? Those kind of new, interestingly, particularly on Sharp Island, there's a whole colony of domestic helpers and other migrants that use that island in the weekends, if you had time to go out there recently. Or these kind of new colonization of the country parks of young people escaping basically into those spaces. Yeah, so now if we go back, just wrapping up, if you look at the latest 5-year plan from last year, public open space, indeed not only open space, but public open space is also mentioned in the last 5-year plan of the government for entire China, but also for here Hong Kong. So this will be an interesting discussion how this will work out and how older areas are integrated, certain kind of conflicts that might be there or opportunities. And then the question like how public spaces and cities can further create this kind of imagination for us what the greater BA area might be in the future. So I will end here and just mention that we are continuing with another open online webinar, Miodrag and me and partners in Brazil actually in 3 weeks from now, and look at those kind of questions, relationship between infrastructure and inclusion in Hong Kong, New York, and Rio de Janeiro. Okay, that's all from my side. Thank you very much. And I give the word to Fanny.
Well, I'd like to take this chance to thank our 2 speakers again, Professor Hendrik Tieben and Professor Miodrag Mitrasinovic. In particular, I would like to thank Miodrag for getting up so early. He is now in Europe, and so he has to get up at 6 o'clock to join us at this webinar. Please join me in thanking our 2 speakers. Yeah.
And thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah. Just a preview on our next and last webinar in the series. The topic is on physical activity and health of children and parents. Big data generated from the Greater Bay Area. The speaker will be Professor Amy Ha, Associate Dean from our Faculty of Education at CUHK. The 2 discussants are Professor Yi Jian Yang, Assistant Professor at the Department of Sports Science and Physical Education at CUHK, and Ms. Ziwing Man, the Principal of Po Leung Kok Lam Min Chen English Primary School. Please join us at our last webinar on August 26th, back to our regular time at 11 a.m. Thank you for joining us today and see you next time. Bye-bye.